From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
The election is over. The holidays passed. It's almost time for lawmakers to get back to work. But when they reconvene in Topeka, what will they get done? Everyone has their own agenda. Which will prevail? What do you think lawmakers should do? That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. Happy New Year and welcome to Kansas Week. I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. Lawmakers return to work Monday, January 9th. But what will they actually do? It all depends on who you ask. We start with a look at the governor's ideas for this coming legislative session. Governor Laura Kelly has lots of ideas for Kansas in her second and final term in office. Topping her list, a promise she made in her first run to expand Medicaid. She told me in a one-on-one interview during the campaign, since this is her last term in office and she doesn't have to worry about re-election efforts, she can afford to spend a little more capital pushing for this legislation. She's also been clear in her support of legalizing medical marijuana, tweeting about it just this month as lawmakers hold their final intersession committee meetings to come up with a compromise bill. She's also come out in support of some tax relief for Kansans, including a back-to-school sales tax holiday in August, cutting income taxes for seniors on Social Security who make less than $100,000 a year, and getting the state's 6.5% grocery sales tax dropped immediately instead of slowly phased out. Finally, she's pledged to protect Kansas' water supply, a resource that's rapidly running out across the state, and not just because of the drought. During the campaign, she told supporters waiting for a miracle is not an option. For decades, Western Kansas has been using more water from the Ogallala Aquifer each year than Mother Nature has replaced. Parts of Western Kansas have just 10 years of water left. And joining us today to help provide a better idea of what we can expect this legislative session, we have Senator Aletha Faust-Goudeau, Democrat from Wichita and Assistant Minority Leader for the Senate, and Representative, almost called you a senator there, Representative Susan Humphreys, Republican from Wichita. Thank you both so much for being here. Let's start off with, that is a very ambitious agenda coming from a governor who is of a separate party from the majority in the legislature, Susan.
Definitely, and some of the things we even agree on.
That seems to happen.
Yeah, targeted tax relief, I think we all agree that that's really important. And that probably would include the sales tax on groceries. We agree on that. The sales tax on seniors, that, as you know, was a big part of Derek Smith's platform. And so, again, we have agreement there on tax relief. I think we might introduce something about a flat tax, which some other states have done, and that gives people relief also. So tax relief, I think we can agree on for sure.
Okay.
And I certainly support a holiday sales tax on school supplies. As a matter of fact, I saw a story a while back, and I started having legislation drafted for a bill, and then I heard that some other lawmakers were interested as well. I actually just emailed out all 39 other senators asking to co-sponsor, or, you know, we've got to do this and work together and give Kansans some tax break on food or school supplies.
And I find it interesting with the back-to-school sales tax holiday is that kind of goes along with some of the other issues we've seen the last couple of years, medical marijuana, the sports betting, those sorts of things. Sorry, I just got over COVID. My brain still is a little bit slow on words sometimes. The sports betting bill, that sort of stuff, where we have surrounding states that are already doing this, and companies are losing business to the surrounding states because we don't have it yet.
You know, as a matter of fact, when I was doing some research on the bill for sales tax on school supplies, I looked at surrounding states and other states and what they were doing, and most of them included clothing also, but I'm just going to, hopefully we could get just school supplies passed. And you talk about medical marijuana. I know that we've dealt with that issue for a long, long time. And on your clip there, I saw Representative Gail Finney in the House chamber, and I know that was one of the bills she worked on. And I'm hopeful for that. That will bring in revenue. Also, with sports gaming, that's going to bring in revenue, and we all know that there's a surplus in the Kansas legislature this year, and everybody's fighting for
Yes,
a
that's
piece of
true.
that money.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, as far as the medical marijuana, I think the committee has been continuing to meet in this off session. Their next meeting is next Thursday, I think the 15th. And the bill we had last year, it seems like people have now been able to read it. It was thick, and now people have read it, and there are tweaks. I think people who weren't sure about it, maybe with some of the tweaks, might come on board. And then there's others who are just going to say it's a federal issue and not something that we should legalize in Kansas. But I think the bill that we see coming up will not be the same bill that we had before.
Well, I served on the conference committee for medical marijuana along with Senator Robles, and I know there is an appetite for it. I know that I met a month ago with some of the proponents and some of the things that they're doing to tweak the legislation so that, and we do hear from those who that will relieve their pain. And so looking at the benefit financially, other states are already doing it. I think we need to catch up and get on board.
And hearing from those patients and things I think is important. I also know some of the testimony was from people who are involved in the marijuana business. And I think that their interest could be less than magnanimous. So, well, we need to look at that too.
Yeah, it's going to be something that we will address this session.
Oh yeah, I mean, lawmakers have been working on it throughout the intersession, so we know it's going to be something that comes up for sure. Of course, the governor isn't alone in having an agenda going into this session. Every city and county across the state is finalizing its legislative agenda now as well. As cities and counties across the state are deciding what they want lawmakers to do this next session, the Kansas League of Municipalities has already turned in its priority list. That list includes ending the state's 6.5% sales tax on food immediately, though it would undermine cities' ability to meet the obligations of STAR bonds for economic development. The league's lobbyists suggest the state look at alternate ways of covering the retirement of those long-term debts using some of its large surplus. The league is also concerned about property taxes, state water policy, traffic codes, housing, mental health issues, liquor regulations, and state mandates. When it comes to water quality and quantity, the league is urging lawmakers to aggressively pursue conservation, protection, and development of water sources, as the amount available in the Ogallala Aquifer continues to fall. We also recognize that what works in western Kansas is different than what works in southeast Kansas, what works in the middle of the state, or works in eastern Kansas. There needs to be nuances in that legislation, the lobbyist told the Kansas Reflector in its podcast. Another concern is a state regulation requiring 2 medical professionals in an ambulance, one to drive and one providing care to the patient. The league says that's a problem in smaller communities and would like the state to allow non-certified drivers. Well, you guys certainly weren't kidding when you said everybody wants a piece of the pie as far as the surplus goes.
Yeah. I loved what was said about the surplus, and we tried to do this last year, was use it on one-time things. Shore up the Capers Fund so that we don't have those payments going forward. So there are things we can do one time that doesn't grow government. It doesn't necessarily hold us year after year after year, because we know at some point there is going to be a recession or something. And so that those one-time things are what I think we need to focus on with the surplus.
I certainly sympathize with businesses, and I support the businesses and those that have made the deals with STAR bonds and so forth. However, you mentioned what happens in western Kansas is different than what happens here where we are, but everybody's got to have good water. We all need water, and we all need food. And I'm certainly hoping that those that have benefited in the past from STAR bonds and other entities for projects, this session, we've got to do something to help alleviate the pain that people are dealing with, struggling just to buy a meal to put on the table. So I hope that we can expedite the eliminating the sales tax on food and this water thing. It's a resource we need, so we've got to deal with that. And so I'm looking at putting people over policies.
And talking about the water issues, while it's different in different parts of the states, we know that it's not just western Kansas that's having problems. The town of Caney in southeastern Kansas had to go on a water emergency a couple of months ago. They have had to increase rates, so if you can use a certain amount of water, and that's the regular rate. But if you go over that, then you have to go to the next rate. And if you go too high, then you go to the next rate. So they've had to increase rates incrementally based on how much you use. They've shut down a couple of businesses, a car wash, a couple of others that rely purely on water. And that's not because of an aquifer running dry. That's because of local rivers running dry because of current drought.
Yeah, and so I'm glad to say that again, our new speaker, Dan Hawkins, has put into place a water committee in the House. I'm not sure what the equivalent is in the Senate. I'm sure there's something. But so the water committee again is looking at that. They took a deep dive last session to try to figure out what can we do, how can we come up with some solutions. And there's interim committees meeting just on water too. So I think we're well aware of it, and hopefully we can come up with some good solutions that people can agree on. Yeah.
Well, in northwestern Kansas, I think is perhaps the prime example of people figuring out a way to agree on it, where all the stakeholders came together. They said, these are our options. What is it we want to do? And they brought a plan to the government to say, okay, this is what you're going to do. But it was that group who came up, and they've actually managed to turn it around. They are the only ones in Kansas that are replacing some of that missing water.
Well, I know also it's going to depend on who lobbies the best, who gets their voices heard the most. I'm looking forward to the individuals that come up for on January 12th, I think, Kansas Day at the Capitol, where people come from around the state of Kansas to lobby, just regular folk coming to lobby for Medicaid expansion, lobby to end the sales tax on food, and those are things we've got to do. I'm to be quite honest, guys, I'm getting so many calls from people who are just saying, can't the governor, can't the president just send us a card for gasoline, or send us a card just to buy groceries. People have stopped eating certain foods, and if you've never dealt with it, you don't understand it, you don't get it. I mean, people are really struggling just to put food on the table. And so I really, since the governors can't run for re-election again, I'm hoping that people will just look at what our constituents need. I know my constituents, they are struggling across the board, and they need help financially, they need help with food, they need help with school supplies, and I hope we'll look at what the people's needs are this time around.
We certainly need to do that for sure. And I would just suggest some of those policies, we can do targeted tax relief, we can do, but some of the federal policies we're not able to really influence. I mean, I think energy policy, we even as state legislators could lobby our federal lawmakers to give us some relief in especially energy policy, which would make a big difference with gas.
Okay, lawmakers lobbying. Well, they all have their own ideas of what should work in this next session. Let's take a look. The Kansas Reflector has taken a look at several bills and initiatives specific lawmakers say they plan to pursue this next session. For example, State Senator Cindy Holscher wants to continue her work from the last few years to end time limits for filing lawsuits in the cases of child sexual abuse. Currently, a survivor must file a lawsuit within 3 years of turning 18 or of discovering an injury or illness resulting from the abuse. Survivors say it sometimes takes years to process their feelings and come forward, by which time they've aged out. Lawmakers on the 2022 Special Committee on Mental Health Beds have made a list of recommendations they'd like to see happen, including adding 50 state beds in the Sedgwick County area. They also want the State Finance Council to release $15 million for a new state hospital so the Department for Aging and Disability Services can begin the development process. And they want to pursue discussions aimed at finding ways to attract more mental health care workers to the state. The Reflector also reports Kansas Republicans expect legislation on abortion rights to hit again this next year. Some anti-abortion activist groups have discussed a potential 15-week abortion ban, and Kansans for Life is pushing for legislation similar to the Born Alive bill, which other states have rejected as too restrictive. Republican lawmakers told The Reflector they hadn't specifically discussed any of these measures yet, but do plan to address abortion bills when they return to work. Well, we have brand new leadership, wide range of topics there.
Yes.
And while leadership in the Senate is stable, it's the same as we've seen for the last couple of years, brand new leadership coming in the House. So I'm going to start with you, Susan.
Okay.
How do you think that is going to affect the direction of what it is lawmakers actually do?
Okay, so our new speaker, Dan Hawkins, was the majority leader. So there's some seamless transition going on there. So I don't know that it's going to be wildly different, especially at the beginning when we see what's going on. I mean, Dan is very much involved with, I'm going to mention mental health and workforce shortage. You know, we know those are really entwined. We don't have adequate mental health and facilities for people, and so those 50 beds coming from ARPA funds, which is federal funds in Sedgwick County, would be really good to see. And Dan's also, he talked to me about just the worker shortage and what we need to do there as far as licensing, maybe let some things up, do, job fairs for people, even younger ages. Let's all go to schools and get people interested in some of the medical fields, which we talked about last night at our meeting. The Board of Nursing could do some things that would help out. So as far as our leadership, you mentioned lots. Those are the things I'll mention that Dan's interested in: mental health and the workforce shortage would be two big things.
What do you see as being priorities in the Senate this year?
Oh, of course, we're going to deal with education funding as usual. I certainly know that we need to deal with issues affecting mental health. We met with Sheriff Easter. We talked about the epidemic of fentanyl. We need to do something to address that issue. I do know that the other day in the Capitol, the Health Committee, chaired by Representative Brenda Landwehr, that they did approve funding for the construction of a new mental health facility here in Sedgwick County, but it can't come fast enough. So we're going to have to do something additional. I serve and met with the Joint Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice Oversight, and we came up with a few recommendations to address the stand your ground laws, some of the foster care issues. You and I serve on that committee.
Yes.
I think we did decide to merge the two bills that Representative Gail Finney had introduced, and I think you recommended one of those bills for legislation in the 2023 session. But we did decide to name those bills after Representative Gail Finney. Just the other day on November 30th, we did make some recommendations for bills that will come out relating to the DCF, the foster care system. That's still a huge major issue that we need to address. I know that I'm going to still try to help with the revoked driver's license status. I know it's just a whole plethora of things coming down the pipeline, but the things that are going to get the most attention are the ones that are going to take the money, and so everybody's going to be fighting over those issues. But I'm hoping that whatever we do, we've got to give our Kansans a tax relief on things. We've got to lessen that burden that they've been dealing with for the last 3 years.
Yeah.
Well, this is a budget year, so money is definitely going to kind of dominate the year.
Yeah, definitely. But I also want to mention a couple of priorities I think in the House will be in that whole discussion about education. There's, education freedom for parents whose children are not fitting in with the public school system, maybe some more choices for them. Not because we don't love our public schools, they are of utmost importance, but they're not meeting the needs of all the families. And so what can we do to help those particular families? Like you said, the students over the institution, I would say. And then the other thing I just want to mention, since it was brought up, was the pro-life stuff. I don't understand how Born Alive bill is too extreme, like a baby's born alive after a botched abortion. There's nothing extreme about trying to save that baby. So that is troubling to me to hear that that's extreme. Now we know that value them both did not pass, and so we have parameters, but it doesn't mean there aren't things that we can't do. For instance, telemedicine. There was just a bill that said physicians could prescribe abortifacients, the chemical abortions, through telemedicine. I just don't understand how a doctor is okay with not having eyes on a patient in that regard. So I would like to see some legislation with the chemical abortions, and even there's a reversal issue with that too that they would see. So that's more choice for women, I feel like.
Well,
that's not about abortion, it's more choice
for women too. I'm going to be addressing some domestic violence issues where women they didn't have a lot of choice during COVID. They were inside and they were abused, and then they went to seek shelter. But there's a lack of beds for women and men who are abused to seek shelter for their children. So we really need to do a little more in that area to help women as well.
And you guys both brought up education, so we're going to take a look at that real quick. Many other Kansas groups have their own legislative agendas. A popular topic is always education. The Kansas Reflector reports lawmakers expect to see a slew of debates this next year on public school financing, vouchers for private schools, transgender athletes, and a parent's Bill of Rights. Sounds familiar, right? That's because we've seen these same topics come up again and again. In addition to those, the Kansas Association of School Board told the Reflector it expects to see efforts to broaden vaccination exemptions, encourage the arming of school employees with guns, and address the shortfall in state aid for special education, which is separate from the general public school financing question. And talking about money again and education, I have been hearing from so many different school leaders that is really a vital piece for them this time.
Yeah,
it's always, education is always high on the forefront. I just got to say this, my daughters I graduated from public school and turned out okay. My daughters did as well and turned out okay. I know that funding is always crucial. I know that, our own superintendent, Felicia Thompson, resigned from USD 259, but she used to always talk about it was hard for them to budget, waiting on what we were going to do and how much funding they were going to get in. And I just have to say over the years in the legislature that's what we battle the most. And of who gets the most funding, where it goes, choice, chartered schools. I just want to educate all of our children, and I hate that we have to battle over the funding for it.
And we have fully funded after the settlement, after we actually were instructed how to fully fund. We have fully funded. And we've increased with inflation. It's tied to an index. But so now I think last year the average public school student, it was $16,000 per year to educate that student. And so we need to really look at outcomes. How is that money making a difference in our outcomes as far as our students being able to read and do math at grade level? And so we've got to look at that and maybe reward the schools that are doing really well. And how are they doing well? And what are they doing, and reward them. And then just again, I think the school choice in states that have more robust school choice, the public schools have actually risen to the occasion. And so everyone in the state is getting more well educated. So that's one reason I'm a proponent of that.
I know with schools, what they're talking about is special education funding. So your average student costs about $16,000. That's how much they get from state and fed together to educate. But then for special ed, for some of those kids, it can cost $32,000 or $94,000, and it keeps going. And the schools, they have to provide the special. Not that they wouldn't, but they are legally bound to provide the special education fund.
But Pilar, how do we deal with those kids in foster care that move around quite a bit? We need to educate them as well. And so I will be supporting the bill that we named our joint committee that we'll introduce as a committee the Foster Care Bill of Rights
Yes.
Act from Representative Gail Finney.
Yeah.
I'm just, how do we do that? How do we follow and track those students to make sure that they are educated
100%.
properly as well?
I think that's great. And I didn't know you were going to name it after Representative Finney, which is great. So she had a foster parent bill of rights and a foster child bill of rights. And I haven't read the foster child bill of rights in depth, but definitely something that we need to look at. And, just the foster system, more accountability, I think is going to be important as we go forward.
Absolutely.
Okay, one last question.
Okay.
We've got a specific question for the two of you. What have I left out that you think will be a big deal or that you personally are pushing for this session?
Well, some groups here, local groups here, they want me to readdress the standard asset forfeiture bill.
Yes.
I know that's been on the agenda, but that will be an issue. There will also be legislation that I'm dealing with. It's a group called Violence Impact. And this is a group of mothers whose children were killed accidentally, just, in the wrong place, wrong time, and they are murdered victims. They want to have the mothers want to have more presence in the courtroom. They want to sit in that empty seat where the victim would be. So they want to be present in the room there. I think it's so much that's going to go on in the Senate.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, I think a lot of the things we've talked about, I can't think of anything specifically that I think we've hit on the big topics. I mean, transportation funding is always going to be a big thing, especially going to electric cars. Our funding comes from gas tax. And so what are we going to do about that? We need to look at that. We need to look at the Parents' Bill of Rights, which has to do with education, but we didn't talk about that specifically. Crime, or what are we going to do as far as that goes? And then the civil asset forfeiture, I agree with 100%. So,
and just to clarify for our viewers, civil asset forfeiture is what?
It is when your assets can, if you get stopped, for instance, in a traffic stop, and your car or maybe cash is seized by the police, you don't necessarily have a charge or a conviction for them to keep that. And so it's,
we want them to return that immediately. We've found that it's been months and years that people were found not guilty and they still don't get their things back from the police. And we did see a story where there was just logs and logs of things. Anyway, it's always great to be on the show with you.
Yeah,
all right,
thank
we're
you.
going to have to drop it right there.
And I hope everybody will come out on December 13th to the South Central
Well, this is
Legislative.
airing after that, and we hope you
Okay.
have a great week. Thank you so much.